very much appreciate that you joined us today. And I'm going to talk about ESAP. So how many of you have heard about this? Raise your hands. Like how many of you have heard about European Single Access Point? See, 1, 2, 3, 4, actually 5 people. Perfect. So we develop grand things in Europe, right? We don't do small things. We only develop grand things. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story which has taken, I think, 18 years now. What I need to say first, because personally, and as a company, we've been involved in shaping up part of the European Single Access Point, particularly developing the cost-benefit study. I need to state this disclaimer that the views are absolutely all my own, and they do not necessarily represent any of the institutions involved or leading the ESAP project. So with that behind us, why the Commission? Before I talk about what ESAP is, let me start with why. Let's imagine that we have someone named Anne in this audience. Do we have someone named Anne? No, Anne. Okay. Well, we have Anne. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. So we've got Anne. So Anne is an investor, right? And Anne is looking to invest in, in one or more of the European particular companies. Well, she's willing to retire maybe here in the Maldives, right? So she's looking for a particularly good investment opportunities. For that, obviously, as an investor, she's looking for data. Then we've got Peter, who is an M&A, mergers and acquisitions expert, and he's looking for some data to actually put together, shape up as a consulting gig. Again, retire in the Maldives, why not? And then Maria, who's an auditor, and when she develops something like a transfer pricing, she needs to actually compare data from 2, 3 different companies and then say, well, actually the prices that we offer between the companies in our group are the same ones as the market prices, right? But these guys in Europe, all 3 of them, when they are looking for data, they stumble particularly in the listed companies field. So we have approximately like 6,000 companies listed on stock exchanges in Europe. And when these guys go out and try to dig out for this data and try to figure out what this data is, how they can analyze that, they stumble upon all sorts of issues. First of all, there are plenty of registries. There's like 27 specifically called registries, officially appointed mechanisms, as the Transparency Directive says. There are multiple languages. There are multiple formats. There are multiple ways to access that data. And it's not really particularly convenient. It doesn't really, put Europe there on the spot, giving the international investors the ability to very quickly look into that data. If you compare it to Edgar in the US, there is one database. You go there, you figure out the data that you like, you search. It's really, really accessible. And of course, in the US, they speak English. In Europe, as you know, for a couple of past years, we are not allowed to speak English. It's not an official language. So we have all the different others. But when we go into these data sets, into those different registries, we stumble upon this issue. It's a very inefficient process. It's very time-consuming for investors, for analysts. It's very costly, to be honest. The bulk of the costs for analyzing and taking decisions about investment being just one of these purposes, is actually going towards searching and preparing the data before you take any decision, before you actually have any data that is comparable. So, the European regulators some time ago established a directive that is called Transparency Directive. That was 2004. And very shortly afterwards, in 2022, we are there discussing the implementation of ESAP. But before that, there were a couple of initiatives established to bring about a little bit of ease to this investors' situation. So first of all, we brought IFRS, a single common accounting standard. So at least that was unified, right? And that was 2005. That was the accounting directive. Then LEI was introduced. And Enrico spoke about it. That was 2017 when ESMA has taken authoritative decisions to actually require LEI from a range of companies which are investing in financial markets. And then there was another initiative in 2020, the ESAP initiative, the European Single Electronic Format, which standardized the electronic format of reporting of financial statements across these companies traded on regulated markets. Right? So that allowed that we had now standardized accounting, standardized identification, and electronic format. The trouble was accessibility. We still couldn't access the data. So we knew that, okay, it's harmonized, it's standardized. Yes, potentially we can use the same software to analyze it, but where do we get it from? There was no single registry, there was no single mechanism to access such a thing. Like what Anna spoke about in terms of BRIS, such a thing did not exist whatsoever on the capital markets across Europe. So in each country, the OAM, the officially appointed mechanism, was an individual organization, or actually an organization that was established that performed the function of the OAM. And the diversity was great. Sometimes it was a business register. Sometimes it was a stock exchange. Sometimes it was a function at the central bank or at the FSA. So you had great diversity in even, so to say, legal mandate of the officially appointed mechanism of the registry. Sometimes it was a for-profit company. Sometimes it was a non-profit public body. So again, you dealt with great variety of ways in which this data was made accessible to investors. A big burden, quite naturally, again, costs and time. So we started thinking back then, together with the Commission, about a novel approach. Obviously, technologies come handy, so why don't we think about putting it all together into a single registry? It's all public data. It's actually required to be, by law, to be made publicly available to anyone that wants. So this accessibility was brought to the Commission action plan, and then there was a group established which basically started talking about this and set the high-level group on future of capital markets, if I remember correctly the report. They decided that this is one of the top recommendations for capital markets. This data accessibility is like one of the most important things that the future of capital markets across Europe requires. Hence, the idea, the vision of ESAP was born. And essentially, when you look at it, the concept technologically and from data perspective is relatively simple. We've got diversified registries, it's like the BRIS network, right? We've got different registries. We don't want to unify them. We just want to get the data in a standardized way. We want to put it all together. We want to describe the data. Just the box that you see on the left is an example of a couple of those pieces of so-called, as we call it, metadata information about the reports. We want to describe the data in a very unified way so that the search mechanism will allow to actually give this data to the investors. We'll provide this data to the investors and will allow them to perform queries, perform search. So Anne, could perform a query, I would like to invest in European companies that have at least, 50% return on investment. Then, you could have Peter, she could basically, via this mechanism, via ESAP, via a single interface, she could access the data that would meet this specific criteria, that would drill down to the level of the necessary accounting concepts. It would calculate the ROI and return the subset of the data. Essentially, this mechanism is nothing particularly innovative in terms of technology. It's a basic functionality of searching, filtering, and querying. But if you think about it from the distributed, decentralized level perspective, like you've got different registries, you want to connect them, then it becomes a bit of a problematic thing. How do you implement a solution like that? On the surface, it sounds pretty easy. But when you drill down into the detail and need to talk about what actually is necessary, there were 3 components that we identified, and they developed further into a sort of architecture that I'll speak about in a second. So these 3 key components into how to implement such a European single access point, as it was called, were machine readability. More specifically, the Council very recently referred to it as extractability of data from the documents. So read it this way: PDF with a scanned document will not work, right? So you cannot extract data from a scanned document, which is PDF. PDF is an electronic format, but actually there's no usability to that data whatsoever, right? You need to OCR it, you need to scan it, you need to understand it. So that the Commission and the Council said no to these kind of documents. They said you need to be able to extract from the PDF the data that will actually help investors take decisions. Second thing, identification. So all issuers, all parties which report to ESAP need to be identifiable by a common scheme, the LEI in this case. It was easy because ESMA has already mandated LEI for a number of entities, so it was a consequential decision. And last but not least, the key component, the third key component that existed there, we had to provide this accessibility in a programmatic way. Here, enhance the application programming interfaces. So build such an architecture that would allow to connect to the different registries via the APIs, get all that data, voila, serve it to the investors. This architecture looks a little bit, more complicated, as you can see. On the top, you see on the left-hand side, you see ESMA, which was tasked by the Commission to actually implement, is tasked by the Commission to implement that entire mechanism. ESMA stands for the European Securities Markets Authority. It's the ultimate federal, so to say, in Europe, European level authority for capital markets. So they were tasked to develop this ESAP, and they were granted a budget. This is still a project in development. It's not ready. So just to make sure that we have the same understanding there. There is plenty of stakeholders on the right-hand side, from business registers through investors associations, public companies associations, auditors, banks, etc., etc. You've got plenty of different parties which may want to actually get access to the data or provide the data or in any other way be affiliated, be using the system. And then comes what sits in the system. So what kind of data could you, technically speaking, obtain about the companies? I'm sorry, before I jump into the what, then below the level of stakeholders, we've got the entire architecture of the system. The difficulty with creating decentralized systems like that is that it really needs to fulfill a number of requirements like scalability, but at the same time, it needs to be secure from cybersecurity perspective. You've got different nodes connecting to the entire system and bringing that data all together. It's not a centralized system like one IT infrastructure. It's actually fairly distributed. So it needs to meet different level, different criteria rather than a software that you design for one specific purpose, right? It's a slightly different architecture of the system. And in order to achieve that, you need to implement open architectures, you need to implement standards, you need to implement metadata management. In a moment, I will speak about what kind of data will be available on ESAP. Because ESAP is a mandatory thing, it's a legislative proposal. It's something that the train has already left the station, it's already running there. So we'll see ESAP when, well, I'll get to that. But yes, but ESAP is something in the motion. So here we are talking about creating a relatively scalable, versatile, flexible type of architecture, flexible type of system. On top of that, which I'll get to again, is the relationship with the different stakeholders. And particularly, for instance, we had during the over 1 year cost-benefit analysis that was conducted in 2020, we had consultation with pretty much all the different groups, including business registers. We spoke about, okay, how does ESAP relate to BRIS? Will business registers be able to actually upload information or maybe derive information from ESAP? What would be the relationship there? What would be the connections? So all these matters were debated and the conclusions were put into a final recommendation, which is available on the Commission's website. That entire architecture serves the purpose of providing data. So now moving to the data, the what, so to say. So what will be available in ESAP? Well, actually, the scope of data is very ambitious. But I will first point to the top, so to say, level data sets. Firstly, financial reports. So we are talking about international financial reporting standards, IFRS reports, the annual ones. That is the key, so to say, area of the data. These reports are already standardized. They are already standardized according to inline XBRL. They have already been collected for the past, Joel, remind me, 1-2 years now, right? Yeah, something like that, across the union. So we are already on the, we have already implemented electronic reporting for that purpose, and these electronic reports will be made available on ESAP as one of the first, so to say, sets. But apart from these, there will be quite a few other things, like the prospectuses information. that is, semi-structured and partially a fairly descriptive document, as if you have ever had a chance to read the prospectus. Then there is a big topic quite naturally across entire Europe about sustainability data, about green, about the so-called CSDR directive. These reports, for these reports, the standards are being developed. EFRAG, the European Financial Regulatory Advisory Group, if I remember correctly, has put forward around 40 standards to propose the scope of this sustainability reporting. They are yet to be implemented as part of the regulation and created as part of the entire infrastructure and ecosystem of Europe and developed by the companies. But these data sets will also be available. We call them ESG, environmental social governance reports. They will be also made available on ESAP. And lastly, actually listed companies, when they perform certain functions in Europe, like they are banks or they are insurance companies, they have this specific type of supervisory reporting that they need to perform, public type of reporting, that they need to conduct, they need to submit to the respective regulators, like the European Central Bank or the EIOPA, the European Insurance Occupational Pensions Authority. So parts of these reports, the public parts of these reports, shall also be made available on ESAP. As you can see, the vision of ESAP is fairly ambitious. On top of that, actually, when you read the analysis, you will get to so-called corporate data scope. We looked across a broad range of events, triggers, data sets that span the entire life cycle of companies, from establishment down to bankruptcy or winning up or transformation. And there are lots of different pieces of information that obviously can be posted on ESAP. Not all of that will be there, but just to give you a bit of a feeling of the scale of ESAP, we are talking about 383 disclosure requirements that we have identified in the relevant legal acts pertaining to the listed companies. Each disclosure requirement could be either a small piece of data or could be an extensive report. So the scope of data altogether that is envisaged to be put on ESAP is massive. It requires a scalable infrastructure, it requires technologies, it requires all the stuff that will fulfill the demand for all the capital markets data across Europe. And now we come to the when. So as I said, we started in, well, actually, ESAP's story, you can trace the beginnings to 2004, where the Transparency Directive was established. And in the Transparency Directive, there was a statement that respective regulators should actually create accessibility, should create a system through which this data could be made accessible to the investors, and it should be public, and it should be available, et cetera, et cetera. But then it took quite a while until the next steps happened. Particular kick to that process was in 2015, if I remember correctly. And then in 2016-17, when the Commission established first proof of concepts using, very interestingly, blockchain technology. We have developed a system to imitate this ESAP on a very, very small scale, saying that each of these OAM will become a node of a blockchain network. It worked, but it wasn't scalable. So this technology wasn't really, particularly from performance perspective, selected to go forward, to be recommended as the production technology for ESAP. Very recently, in the past 2-3 years, the entire, so to say, legislative train, as we call it, sped up. And currently we are at the stage where the most recent is the 2022 from June. There is a position from the Council of Europe stating how ESAP should be implemented, etc. As you know, we have gradual, so to say, stages of developing and putting forward a legislation of that scale. Currently, it is the Council is the latest decision. Now the Council is obliging, among other, ESMA to develop ESAP according to these plans. As far as I know, ESMA received funding already from the Commission's budget towards that. So we should be seeing that happening. The original plan was to have ESAP established by 2024, but it was very unrealistic for the scope of this project. And the last, so to say, piece of information that I was able to obtain from the Commission was that They are looking towards 2025, 2026. They have run certain consultation, and the consultation feedback was, you're a little bit too ambitious with this magnitude of the project. So you need to scale down a little bit and you need to extend the timeline. I think 2025, 2026 is still ambitious, but there is a slight chance of possibility that it will actually appear. And last but not least, what's in it for the business registers community, right? Internationally and in Europe. So we need to look from the perspective of what are companies looking for from such a registry. We have had extensive consultation with SMEs, with medium companies, with large companies, public, etc., with associations of these, with associations of the SMEs, associations of the listed ones. They told us that effectively what they are looking for are three things. Access to finance. By putting forward their data, they are actually looking for cheaper financing. They are looking for more efficiency in terms of getting some funds. They are looking for promotion. They want to promote their services, their products, their activities. And last but not least, they are looking for for an establishment of a trust when they are attempting certain grants or requesting certain grants or applying for them, when they are applying for a procurement procedure. This is the source of trust. Such a registry, such like ESAP, would become an authoritative source of information about these companies. So when we know that, when we knew that, when we learned that, we started looking at particularly this first one. The second, the promotion and the grants are very kind of like self-explanatory, but what does it mean that a company is looking for an easier option or better financing? You need to look from the perspective of what is the size of the company. So we started dividing the companies into the different clusters, and then we looked across what are the different financing options, from founders' money to seed money, through all the different stages, like even going public or getting a VC, venture capital, or anything like that. At different of these stages, the companies put forward different types of information, and at different of the stages, they focus on different types of financing activities. So you can see those brackets highlighted there, that for small and medium, for micro and small companies, the top most interesting financing options, the most commonly used, are the ones that are top in the column. All right, so these are the most commonly used. For all companies, regardless of the size, data in ESAP provided for the trade, so to say. It's a boosted kind of like, it was supposed to help with trading, just the thing that businesses know natively. And for the largest one, so medium and large companies, the lower level options in terms of financing were the most interesting ones. Why is it important to understand it? Because then you can shape up the functionality of ESAP accordingly to the needs of the investors and accordingly to the needs of the companies which will use it to present to their potential funders. And then this is literally my last slide. So what could there be for business registers? In terms of EU, very interestingly, the Council changed the wording proposed by the Commission and opened up the possibility for business registers. I shouldn't be saying that this may not necessarily be correct interpretation of the law, so I advise you to look into that very closely. But if I understand it correctly, the new wording allows business registers to provide data instead of OEMs, which is a revolution. Which, if you think about it very carefully, if you are a registry from Europe, that gives you a massive legislative, so to say, power. So that's one. But I would like to stop here because it's very difficult to get through the muddy waters of the European Commission legislative proposals, right? So you need to get your lawyers on it and just figure out yourself. Then for non-EU, you will be able to actually connect to this registry and plug in data. That option, that availability is also allowed, is also provided by the ESAP proposal. So obviously it's a voluntary thing. It's absolutely not necessary or demanded, but it opens up the opportunity to get comparability, visibility, and the possibility to draw the data from a relatively large market of the European Union. And then, in terms of the beneficial ownership and AML checks, this is yet another set of data, a very reliable, very trusted set of data, obviously only pertaining to the limited scope set of companies. However, as I said earlier, business registers may voluntarily provide information. SMEs may voluntarily provide information to this entire single access point. And we can reasonably expect that those companies which will be looking, for instance, for these financing options may actually voluntarily provide this information. There might be different drivers, so ESG information for visibility and reputational purposes and so forth. And then, there is going to be a heaps of data available, just like with EDGAR. So you can take a look at the US history. When EDGAR was established, out of the sudden, it was possible to do magical things, with these data sets. So that kind of availability of data and a very granular level, when you can drill down to defined benefit plans position on the financial statement of a given company, it gives immense opportunities. To whet your appetite, there is a brilliant company from Mexico that created, based on such structured data, they created a voice-controlled mechanism which allowed investors to search through the data submitted to the Mexican Stock Exchange. And literally, I saw it. The gentleman spoke in one of the conferences, said, Cortana, can you show me the data that I'm interested in the data from the listed companies? And Cortana responded, I have like 15,000 reports, annual financial reports, balance sheets, and profit and loss accounts from this and this group of companies. Which industry would you like? And then he specified, like, okay, let me show me the financial ones and some other. Cortana responded, and then in like 3-4 voice, guided steps, the mechanism responded with the data set, which shortened the query searching and preparation immensely. That was just a brilliant example of natural language processing mechanism built on top of the data set. And the data sharing and access is literally the one of the last points that I would like to speak about. Well, the ESG data is becoming particularly important. There are so many standards to choose from if you want to report any ESG data. So obviously, if you have a data set like ESAP available in 2025, 2026, hopefully it will actually serve the purpose to create a bit of a connection globally with all the different jurisdictions and demonstrate those companies and promote those companies who are sustainable and who are ecologically, so to say, helping our planet to survive. With that, I would like to thank you very much for your time. Finished 2 minutes before time, so hopefully you enjoyed that.